All right, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Welcome to our second of 4 sessions on working through Advent with Isaiah. So I apologize in advance for my voice. I hope it holds out for the hour. But anyway, you have to put up with it. Why don't we open with a word of prayer? God, we give you thanks for this opportunity to be together and share in the study of your word. Open our hearts and our minds, our ears and our spirits to the message you have for each of us in this season of Advent. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so I wanted to start this morning and talk a little bit about translation. We got into that last week a little bit with the parallels, which I've given you again today, with the different versions, and we had some good conversation about some of the different different things that came up out of that, and so I just wanted to fill in a little information and give you a little more background into that. So the Bible has been, as of September 2023, the complete Bible has been translated into at least 736 different languages. The New Testament has been translated into an additional 1,658 languages.
Wow.
And smaller portions of the Bible have been translated into 1,264 other languages. That's according to the Wycliffe Global Alliance, which tracks things like that. So at least some part of the Bible has been translated into at least 3,600 different languages. So,
Sorry, can I just, is that languages rather than versions of English, for example?
Or dialects and things, yes.
Well, you know, we've got the Youth Bible and we've got,
yeah, well, it wouldn't count things like that.
they
It would
wouldn't be
just,
counted.
it would, yeah,
So it's actually even more than that,
yeah.
in a sense.
Oh, and, yeah,
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 when you count the
yeah, because certainly there are,
translations.
certainly there are, I mean, any number of just English translations
Yes,
that all
yeah,
differ
that's
from,
what I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
So they don't count.
No.
We only count English one.
that's right, that's right,
Goodness, that means it's an awful lot.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that I remember being hammered into my head when I was doing my seminary studies was the idea that any translation, and unless we're reading it in the original Hebrew or Greek, or reading translation, that any translation is interpretation. Because if you're interpreting a text, there are going to be occasions where obviously the original language does not line up exactly with how you would say it in English.
Yeah.
And so an interpreter, despite what their intentions are or whatever, have to make decisions about how to translate something. And that can be innocuous, or it can make a difference in how you read the text. So on the back of your parallels here, there's a few examples of, very general examples of the different ways that biblical translation takes place. So there's this formal equivalence idea that are translations whose intent is, a direct translation, word for word translation. Now, obviously, you can't do that exactly. When we talked last week about different root words that didn't have cognates in English, and so, again, it's not going to be exact. But that was the idea, for example, between, for the King James translation and a number that have followed, the New Revised Standard Version, which I know is the Pew Bibles. Here at Trinity, it tends to be the one I tend to use, also falls into that sort of trying to translate it word for word. And there's a list of a few other translations there. So then there's the functional equivalence or thought for thought method. And the idea behind that is we're gonna translate this. We know that, the words are maybe not gonna match up exactly, but we wanna take what the original thought would have been in the original and then translate it. And so that results in something a little different. So the NIV Bible is one that maybe a lot of you might have at home. The Good News Bible that we're using here falls into that sort of thing. These tend to be translations that aim, a lot of them that would say, translating into the vernacular, that translating into modern English, those sorts of if you see that on, on the description of a particular Bible, it probably is one of these thought for thought sort of things. And then there are just paraphrases. So if you've ever read or seen The Message, which is a pretty prominent one at the moment, that essentially is a paraphrase. So that was, The Message was written by Eugene Peterson, who's a minister in the U.S. or was, I'm not sure if he's still alive, but, and basically he, just kind of reworked the Bible and wrote an equivalent of it, but didn't worry about matching the words up. If you look in The Message, whereas most Bibles, the verses, or how we're used to seeing them, verse and then a couple of lines and another verse. So it's kind of written in paragraphs like you would read like a novel, and to the side it'll say like 5 through 8. So it'll be those verses written that way. So all of them are helpful in different ways. But they all kind of come at it from a different perspective and direction. And so the important thing to know, just as if you're doing reading or studying, is just to kind of understand what the intent is in what you're reading, and how that's going to impact it. Does that make a huge difference if you read a psalm from the King James versus the Message? Well, they're going to sound very different when you read them. If you're reading them just for comfort and inspiration and so forth, it probably doesn't really matter. If you're getting into really kind of studying at a closer level, then it's just good to know how that's working, because all translation is interpretation.
If we were to translate it, we would use the language that we use today, wouldn't we? Which wouldn't necessarily be of, say, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago.
Well, that's
because
right.
language evolves, doesn't
That's
it?
right.
Yeah.
Well, that's, you think about the King James version, and so much of that, we were talking about that earlier. So much of that's ingrained because it was the standard for so long, and in a lot of churches remains sort of the standard.
Bits you know of by heart, aren't they?
Yeah, but if you open it up to a passage you're not familiar with, it's really hard to read, because the language is different.
All the hymns and things are all based.
Yeah, a lot of the hymns have the
use that translation.
Yeah, but you're right. And I think that would be the objective of most of these translations, is to make it into something that's accurate but accessible.
Yeah.
We do get paraphrases, like just going back to hymns, we do get paraphrases of psalms.
Yeah.
And they're often marked as, labelled as that,
Mm-hmm.
particularly if they've been made metrical to fit bit, so that sometimes it will actually say paraphrase of some.
Yes, yeah,
or
that's
say
right.
para or something.
So, while we're talking about translation, any Star Trek fans here? It's your lucky
A
day.
little bit.
A little bit. So I'm gonna pass this around, and I invite you to take it home and read it at your leisure. And it may or may not hold any interest at all to you, but this is an article from the Wall Street Journal in the early 1990s, and I have looked and looked to find the actual citation, and I can't find it now. But it is an article about trouble in the camp of linguists who were translating the Bible into Klingon. So,
Is that one of the languages?
Klingon is an alien language. The Klingons are a race of warriors. And so part of it is a bit glib in that, these scholars are arguing over an artificial language. But I like this because it does reveal some of the challenges of, so on the back, I'm just gonna look at one paragraph here and then I'll let you read it at home. But the second paragraph on the back starts with, consider the line from Mark. We have 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Klingon doesn't have words for loaves or fish. So the literalists use a Klingon word which means grain food and another Klingon word which means water animal. Now, this other professor, translating the same sentence using things with which the Klingons would be familiar, uses a Klingon phrase meaning we only have 5 blood pies and 2 serpent worms. So, it is funny, but in a roundabout way, that is the same challenge that, well, maybe not exactly the same, but it's a similar challenge. And in other places in the article, it talks about how certain ideas that are prominent in the Bible are not necessarily cultural ideals that, this particular race would be familiar with, and so how do you relate? Anyway, it's just an interesting read, and maybe will give you pause for thought on how some of this translation stuff.
That's not just it says about the problem with using going into Esperanto.
Yeah.
Which I think had always been a problem with Esperanto, because that was conceived as a language where you didn't have any synonyms.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You didn't have door and portal were the same word,
I understand that Hebrew didn't use vowels, they just
That's
used
right.
signs over the top. But if you take some of our words and you take out the vowels, you've got real problems.
Well, that's it, that's it. So all of those things really contribute to,
Yeah, the difficulties, yeah.
yeah. So as we look at the text today, we'll see a few places where decisions were made. And again, may or may not have earth-shattering consequences, but it's just interesting to sort of look at them and see how they can change how you read something. So this is on page 677 in the Bible. And so if we start at the beginning, in verse 1, so there are a couple of different renderings of, this is talking about the shoot that comes out of the stump of Jesse. And so it was, the similar passage in Jeremiah was the Old Testament reading on Sunday. So those of you that were here heard about that because I preached about it. But this is the Isaiah passage. But what's interesting to know is that the word that in the translations we have, the only one it shows up in is in the Tanakh, which is the Jewish translation. Translates it as the stump of Jesse. And the Hebrew word that's translated there is Geza. And so Robert Alter, who wrote the translation on the right, had a long note in his translation about this, and he says that that the JPS has it wrong when they suggest that it's the stump of Jesse, because that implies that the tree has been cut down, and that Isaiah would not have understood that Isaiah saw the Davidic line lasting forever. And so he says that it's incorrect to translate that as stump, because it's not consistent with Isaiah and his ideal. So he uses stock. The NRSV uses stock, which is, can be another word for trunk. But it's interesting that the Good News Bible talks about a tree that has been cut down. So you can kind of see where there's some differences in how to understand where it is that this shoot is.
But we also
growing up.
use the phrase bloodstock, i.e. something you can breathe from, don't you? So something
Well,
you can
that's
come
right,
from.
it could, yeah, yeah. Well, because there's certainly that grafting sense, and yeah. Which brings up a whole other point,
Yeah.
is how you understand that. Is it something that's grafted on, or where does it, anyway. But just for an example, even in that, and I mean, I think that verse is probably a phrase that, we're familiar with, because we do hear it in Advent quite a bit. You hear this particular reading, or you hear the one from Jeremiah, and the stump of Jesse is something that I didn't look up what the King James says, but I wonder if it says stump, because that sounds awfully familiar.
So there's these lots of big wall paintings of the Jesse tree, often being painted over, but was put on, showing all the lineage of Jesus.
That's right, yeah. So in verse 2, we see the repetition of the word spirit in verse 2. And it's interesting to remember that in Hebrew, the word for spirit is ruach, which also means, anybody remember what else it means? Breath.
Right.
So spirit and breath are the same word in Hebrew. So, it's just, a lot of times when you see, especially in an Old Testament text, and it's talking about spirit, it's worth looking at to think is there a play there on breath as well as spirit. Now, I don't know that there so much is in this particular passage.
Does that apply right at the beginning? The Spirit of God passing over the waters or something?
Yeah, so there's very much, and that's a word that, again, depending upon how you choose to translate it, can really shape how someone reading that understands that particular passage. So you will notice in Alter's translation at the beginning of verse 3, kind of at the end of that paragraph, he translates that end as his very breath is the fear of the Lord. So he's tying into that play on words with that as well.
Sorry, is that his very breath is or in? This says in.
I'm sorry, in.
Is it
His
in?
very breath in the fear of the Lord.
Breath in the fear of the Lord.
Yeah,
The middle one uses the word delight.
yes, yeah. So in verse 3 then, if we go on down a little bit, so this is an example of just how translation can kind of, if you look at the New Revised Standard Translation, he shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his ears hear. Does that remind anyone of another biblical passage? So it's very likely a reference to the story in 1 Samuel, when Samuel is searching for, well, David, for the king. And Samuel's worried about how is he going to know. God sends Samuel out, Samuel's the prophet, to find the next king. And Samuel's nervous because how's he going to know? And God says, the quote is, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart."
Then you ask Jesse to go if he has any more sons.
Yeah. So when you hear that tied in with this connection with Jesse and David, it's probably a practicing Jew at the time would definitely have heard that connection. But what's interesting is in the which one was it? Well, in the Good News one, it changes a little bit. It says, "He will not judge by appearance or hearsay." So that's sort of, when you make a decision like that in translation, you can lose that connection in a way. Does that make sense? So, most of us do not have the text memorized in the way that a lot of Jewish people in the ancient world would have known that, and probably wouldn't hear that immediately anyway. But it is important, because that's probably the intent of it being there in the first place, is it makes that connection back to that original story.
Why does the Good News Bible not refer to Jesse then? Why is it? It talks about the royal line of David.
Yeah.
Because that's another, not you referring to Jesse, that's also another, loses that link in a way, doesn't it?
Well, that's true, yeah. So, I mean, again, so you gotta think about the Good News translation, if their intent is to convey the idea, but the concern is not that it's word for word. And certainly part of the Good News translation was very much focused on making something that was in the in modern English. Then perhaps the choice is that well, people are going to know who David is, but people may not remember who Jesse is, so we'll just say, well, this is the royal line of David, because that's the point, is that, you know, the shoot coming out of the stock of Jesse is the line of David. Yeah. So, but again, a decision that's made in translation. Let's see here. So going on to verse 4. So anything jump out in verse 4?
the rod of his mouth.
Yes, okay. So that shows up in,
It's in all of them, isn't
is
it?
it in the good news one as well? Yeah. So this is an image of, well, it's a violent image in a lot of ways. This is depicting, so this is depicting this whole passage is a prophecy about the Messiah. And one of the qualities of the Messiah is that he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. So, a couple of things there. One is that really stands in contrast with sort of the next section, which is everybody lives together in harmony and peace. But you also, again, have this connection with breath and spirit. I mean, the description is that he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. So, I mean, that's got to be the power of his speech.
Power of his words.
Yeah. And with the breath of his lips, he shall kill the wicked. So, either he really likes garlic, or, possesses this, I mean, this is amazing power that this Messiah will have. And then it talks about righteousness or justice, depending on the translation. And it's talking about, the NRSV says, righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins. So, in ancient times, you would have worn a belt around the waist and a belt around your loins if you were getting ready to go into battle. So this is a depiction of the Messiah. Well, it's a description of the power that they have of destroying the wicked. But he's clothing himself, arming himself in righteousness or justice. So,
The belt around your loins would be your sword belt,
yes,
or a belt for a dagger to
Yeah.
kind of attack or defend yourself.
yeah.
Doesn't mention that in the Good News Bible at all. Not the
No.
not the war
No,
image.
no.
You know.
Yeah, I mean, it says he will,
Squeeze it down in a couple of words.
Yeah.
he'll rule his people with justice and integrity, which
It's very different.
is very different.
Yeah.
Very different, yes, yeah. So,
I just realised that what I'm asking about Jesse and David, because we use, I'll read from the Good News Bible, but your quotes for this series come from the RSV, don't
yes,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it's yeah, I mean, the Good News translation there, at his command the people will be punished and evil persons will die. He will rule his people with justice and integrity. It is a much softer version of that. Yeah. Yeah, it would be interesting to have a really detailed set of footnotes on this translation to know how and why certain decisions were made. But yeah, very much a difference there.
Presumably, the people at the time would have understood why the person would wear two belts,
Yes,
which we didn't. So,
Well, that's right,
Says it all,
that's right,
yeah.
that's right. So, yeah, so I mean, some of those details can fall away and wouldn't affect necessarily how we would understand them. Yeah, so again, a difference between a word-for-word translation in the NRSV and a thought-for-thought one. But even in that, they do feel different, the two different translations that are yielded from that. All right, so if we move on down, we get into probably some of the more familiar bits of this passage. And there's not massive differences in the different translations, but there's a few of them that are worth taking a look at. And this would be the passage starting in verse 6, with the wolf shall live with the lamb. Or I think the King James is probably the wolf shall lie down with the lamb, right? So part of it is to think about what is Isaiah doing here? Is this, in Isaiah's mind, is this a literal prediction of what will happen? Or is this a symbolic representation of a radical reordering of nature? Because the image this creates is, it's iconic in a lot of ways. There's a lot of famous artworks that depict this scene. But do you think Isaiah literally believed that this is what would happen, or is this
using extremes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Surely he couldn't for 1 minute have thought that, what was it? Lions are going to become vegans, really.
Yeah. Well, and so I think it's interesting, last week there was the image of turning swords into plowshares, and while you can physically do that, that's probably a symbolic expression, right? That's the ultimate goal, that transformation that's represented by that metaphor will take place. Something just to note again on translation stuff is in verse 6, you'll see in the Tanakh and in the NRSV, in the third line it says, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. So Robert Alter talks about this particular verse, and in the Jewish tradition, the authoritative Jewish Hebrew texts from which all of their translations would be derived dates from between the 7th and 10th centuries, and includes the line and the fatling together. It talks about a fatling. But Alter cites two older versions of Isaiah that instead say, instead of the bit about the fatling, if you look at his translation, say, and the calf and the lion shall feed together. So he says that's the more appropriate way, because the fatling doesn't make as much sense, and the image should be the calf and the lion feeding together. Now what's interesting is that's the same way that the Good News translates it. If you look at that verse, calves and lion cubs will feed together. And there's even a footnote about it, footnote U, some ancient translations will feed. So I just think that's interesting that of all the different
Robert
changes
also
in,
gives a child a gender, doesn't he?
I'm sorry?
Robert Alto,
Mhm.
the only one who makes it a male.
Oh, that's true, yeah, yeah. A little lad leading him, yeah, yeah.
But isn't that how the description of David, when he was summoned
Mm.
by Jesse to come from the fields, he's the lad who looks after the sheep or something?
Well, that could be, that could be. Yeah, he didn't make note of that, but you're right, I mean, that could be another tie-in to that story. All right. The other couple of notes I have are, again, are probably not incredibly changing the meaning of the passage or anything. In verse 7, this is about the lions becoming vegan. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. Alter says that the Hebrew word, tevin, usually translates as straw and can be frequently found in the descriptions in the book of Exodus when they talk about brick making, about the slaves were making bricks. And so that would have definitely been straw. But then it can also mean hay, and that strictly speaking, and I'm going on his word, straw is not edible, but hay is. So, yeah, so he says that, again, if it's symbolic, it doesn't really matter, but the idea that the lion wouldn't eat straw, it would eat hay. And then finally in verse 10, while they more or less all kind of say the same thing, the syntax in the original Hebrew for verse 10 apparently doesn't make a lot of sense. And so each of the translations in verse 10 are different, possibly because they're trying to make sense of what may just have been essentially not a typo in the original Hebrew, but it could have just been a clerical mistake where there's just some syntax that doesn't seem to make sense.
There's a slight difference. It says, nothing evil or harsh shall be done, but in New English Bible it says there will be nothing harmful or evil. So that implies objects as well as actions.
Yes. Well, and also, there's a difference in 10. So it's interesting that the Tanakh, which in the first verse talked about the stump of Jesse, and remember that Alter pointed that out as an issue theologically, in verse 10 translates it as stock. But the other two translated as root.
Root of Jesse.
And in the Good News version, it doesn't speak at all about a root or a branch or a
Jesse.
stump, or Jesse, or Jesse. Yeah.
They're going to be consistent, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's interesting, I was talking about because of the lineage, I actually missed a complete generation out of it.
Yeah. So that's a lot of nitpicky translation stuff.
Very
But I think it helps us to look at the text a little differently. Thinking about the text as a whole, though, how does the passage relate to our understanding of Advent? Or how do we think of it in those terms, I guess? What does it tell us about this Messiah for whom we are to watch and prepare for?
It sounds like he's going to be an all-powerful figure that will crush the evil and
Yeah.
raise up the good, which
Sort
is
of
what
warrior
people were
like,
expecting,
yeah.
weren't they?
Be all right,
Yeah.
but it'll be all right in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
earth will be
Yeah.
filled with the knowledge of the Lord, the
Yeah.
glory of the Lord. I mean,
Yeah.
that's ever so well quoted. I mean, the whole hymn's written about that.
Yeah.
Definitely not the good news, but the others, it's definitely a sort of warrior type
Yes.
figure, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is why it was all wrong for them, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Jesus wasn't the person they were expecting.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't have an army.
But his weapons
Had some disciples.
are justice and
Mhm.
righteousness. His weapons are not swords,
No.
Yeah.
But they're not used to
So-
that, are they? They're used to.
spears, but it's saying
Yeah.
quite clearly,
Yeah.
the weapons are different. There's the image,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but we're using justice, we're using righteousness, we're treating people with equity.
Yeah.
This is what this person will do. And this person won't judge on what he sees or hears. He will judge on what he knows of God.
That's why I think the Jews were a bit disappointed because they
Yeah.
wanted somebody who would rush in and, you know,
Sort
call
out
the Romans
Romans.
and sort everything out, didn't they? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
And this, when this was written, they wanted someone to sort out the Babylonians.
Well, yes. Yeah.
Mm.
Over the history, they've always wanted someone to sort out their name. They never got with their name as ever.
Well, that's
The
why-
Babylonians or the Assyrians or the Romans or
Yeah.
yeah.
Or the Russians.
Russians.
Or the Russians.
It hasn't changed really, has it?
No. No.
Still
No.
there.
Do you think you'll, again, the passages that we're looking at in this study will be the Old Testament passages next year in Advent. So a year from now, when
Well, I remember.
when you hear this text read, do you think you'll hear it differently or think differently
Well,
about it?
maybe.
Hope so.
I don't even remember what I had for breakfast. But we'll try.
Well, this will be recorded, you can go back and watch it.
It's easy to do the same every day. Have the same every day, it's a lot easier.
Sorry?
Have the same every day, it's a lot easier.
It is, I think it is interesting for some of the reasons that have been mentioned. Sort of put this in tension with, obviously, we look at this through the lens of,
2,000 years of history.
well, that's it, and through our Christian theological
Yes,
perspectives.
Yeah.
And so we can look at that and say, well, Isaiah's talking about Jesus, and in some ways,
He
that is
possibly
who
was,
Jesus
yeah.
is.
Yeah, we don't know whether it's wishful thinking or prophecy, really. do we?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, because even the violent bits,
mm.
and, there aren't too many stories, but there are stories where, Jesus acts out of anger or, frustration.
Yeah.
But even the more violent bits of this passage are tempered by the fact that, as Barry mentioned, that, the weapons are justice and righteousness and faithfulness, which I suppose we could argue, is fairly accurate. So, I think it's just interesting to think about, to be reminded that this is who the Jewish people were placing all their hope in
Mm-hmm.
coming, and how we can look back and say, well, yeah, that's kind of how it shook out, parts of it, but you can also see where that's not really what,
Well, they've got an awful lot of aggressors, haven't they? I mean, a bit later on it says God will destroy Babylon. He'll destroy the Assyrians. He'll destroy the Philistines. He'll destroy the Moabites. In fact, everybody, Syria, Israel,
yeah,
Sudan, Egypt, there's a whole long list of the places that they just want to.
take care of all.
Well, it hasn't changed a lot.
No.
has it?
Is this still what the Jews today?
Yeah,
This is their vision of
Syria,
prosperity.
Lebanon,
Pages
Egypt, yeah,
18 and
yeah.
19 of the chapter before.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think,
What we're living now.
I think it probably depends what flavor of Judaism, you know. I mean, much like Christianity, there's a whole
Range.
a whole range of, you know, literalists and all that, so it would be hard to say definitively, but I mean, I think ultimately if, you know, all these prophetic writings in the Old Testament are pointing towards this Messiah, then that is ultimately what they are looking forward to.
You're taking back to verse 6, with the breath of his, from the altar on, with the breath of his lips.
Yeah,
The Revised Standard Version's got breath of his lips, and you talk about breath and spirit being the same word.
yeah,
It's through his spirit that this will be done. And is he talking in temporal terms, or is he talking in eternal terms about afterlife and living with God?
well, that's a good question.
We don't know.
Well, and I mean, the other bit of that to think about is that, most Jews don't think in terms of afterlife. So, yeah, so how do you understand that? And we may come away with a completely different reading of that than, you know, one of our neighbors who's Jewish, who doesn't have that, same perspective, I guess.
I didn't know that. I didn't realise Jewish, they don't think about what's going to happen after death.
No,
They don't
they
know.
don't have heaven in heaven.
No,
No.
did you know that?
No.
What's this concept of Abraham's bosom or something like that?
Well, I mean, again, there are differences.
Yes.
But I mean, my understanding is that, you know, as a Jewish person, you should live in a way that honors God and that leaves your family name esteemed. And
That's it.
that's a good,
Family.
yeah.
It's your legacy here.
Yeah. So, yeah, so I mean, you know, there's some differences in, you know, they have they're big on observing like anniversaries of family members' deaths.
Yeah.
And part of that is the grieving process, but part of it also is an active remembering and, well, I don't want to say something because I don't know.
To worship, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but I think it has something to do with this idea, and I don't know if this comes directly from Judaism or not, but, you know, the idea that as long as someone remembers you, you kind of
You live on.
That's it,
live
that's
on,
it.
Yeah.
and when the last person doesn't remember you, then,
That's it.
That's it.
yeah. So I think that ties into why legacy is so important and why they're much more tied into, I don't know if it's the case over here, the synagogues I've been to in the US, many of them you'll go into, and they will have a large plaque or board of some type with all these different names of deceased members of that congregation, and they'll have lights next to them, and some of the lights will be on, and those are the people who, for this month, is their, their month of
Okay.
remembrance.
Yeah.
And so I guess the idea is you walk down that hallway and you see all of those different names, and that's part of that remembering.
Well, we have a book of remembrance, don't we?
No, that's true, yeah.
To remember people.
Yeah.
Yes.
But we don't light candles.
No, no.
do we?
No. But I mean, you think about, this is a select group, I suppose, but Remembrance Day, read out the names
Yes,
of,
that's true.
yeah, so I'm sure all that's a big amalgamation of a whole bunch of different,
Yeah.
Traditions and thoughts and so forth. But, yeah, getting back to the original point though, it would influence how this section about the wolf lying down with the lamb, is that an image of some sort of heaven, afterlife sort of thing? Or is it an image of what will happen on earth when the Messiah comes? Because I mean, that would be a difference.
It's not what the Garden of Eden was about, is it? There must have been plenty of animals fighting each other.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think a lot to think about and consider. So, next week, Isaiah 35, 1 to 10. And then I do have some music to end with today. The piece I want to use today is, it's a choral piece, showpiece, called The Dream Isaiah Saw. It was written in 2001 by Glenn Rudolph, words by Thomas Traeger. And it had been commissioned by the Bach Choir Pittsburgh for their Christmas concert that year. And Rudolph was writing it when the 9/11 attacks happened, and finished writing it a couple weeks after those attacks. And so it apparently has some influence over what he wrote. But what you will hear in this piece is a lot of the language that we've either heard in these last two passages or will hear in the ones we're going to read later on. So this is The Dream Isaiah Saw.